right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Caleb McKay. I am the FAFSA Completion Senior Manager with Schoolhouse Connection. I'm joined today by Jillian Sitar, Director of Higher Education. And today we are going to be talking about FAFSA and homeless youth, focusing on scenarios and solutions. Just as a note, we will be focusing primarily on whether students qualify as an unaccompanied homeless youth, as an independent student for financial aid purposes. So a little less focused today on best practices and resources and more just on common questions we get about does a student qualify as an unaccompanied homeless youth, specifically for financial aid. And so some general housekeeping. This webinar will last about an hour and the chat should be disabled, so please enter any of your questions in the Q&A box. And again, as a reminder, our focus today is on whether students qualify as independent students through an unaccompanied homeless youth determination for financial aid purposes. That will be our focus today with the questions we receive. This session is being recorded and you will receive a certificate of attendance after attending this webinar. And if you haven't already, please join our Slack community. It's a great place to connect with peers doing similar work as you, ask questions, and also connect with Schoolhouse Connection staff. For anyone who is not familiar, Schoolhouse Connection is a national nonprofit working to overcome homelessness from prenatal to post-secondary, and we do that through strategic advocacy, practical assistance, and partnership with youth and families experiencing homelessness, as well as schools, early childhood programs, institutions of higher education, and service providers. So if you haven't visited our website, I highly recommend it. There's a wealth of free resources and tools and information at your disposal. And then also join our newsletter. It's a great source to keep up to date on state and federal legislation and policy changes and information for webinars such as this one. So in this next hour, we are going to start off with an overview of homelessness and the FAFSA. I'm going to go over some general reminders. And then we have our scenarios broken up into two different categories. The first being K-12 and service providers from their perspective, and then the second group from the perspective of financial aid administrators. And then at the end, we will touch on some advocacy and resources for students experiencing homelessness. And then if we have time, address some questions at the end. So when we are talking about unaccompanied homeless youth on the FAFSA, we are using the federal definitions provided in the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And so one of the key differences between the K-12 system and higher education or financial aid is that to qualify as an independent student, students must be unaccompanied. So unaccompanied is defined as not living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. And then to be an independent student through this route, a student has two options. They can either be considered unaccompanied and homeless, or they can be unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness. So with the unaccompanied and homeless route, again, unaccompanied means they're not living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian. And then homeless is when the student is lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Now, our other option, if they are not experiencing homelessness currently, is unaccompanied, so the same definition. And then self-supporting is when they pay for all of their own expenses, including their housing, and at risk of homelessness is when their housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. Now, homelessness doesn't always have a clear sign or indicator. It's not always obvious from an outside perspective that a student may be experiencing homelessness. And so the situations can be complicated and complex. And the definition does expand beyond the typical living in a shelter or in their car or on the street. So two main examples I want to point your attention to is sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reason. This is commonly referred to as being doubled up or couch surfing. usually just staying with others. So we frequently see this when maybe a student doesn't feel safe living at home or staying with their parents. So they may be staying with a family friend or extended family member in the meantime. And then another example that can sometimes fly under the radar is a student living on campus in a residence hall or on the dorms, but would otherwise have no place to go. So a good question to ask is when the dorms close over breaks or holidays, does that student have fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence to go to? And if they do not, then they would qualify as homeless. We created this handy little flow chart to help with that decision tree. So the first question we want to ask, is the student unaccompanied? So even if the student is experiencing homelessness, if they are still with their parents or legal guardians, they're not considered an unaccompanied homeless youth, which means they're still considered a dependent student for financial aid purposes, and which means parent information needs to be reported on the FAFSA. And if this is the case, then I would recommend the student reach out to the financial aid office to ask about any other resources that may be available to help them with their current situation. So let's say the student is unaccompanied. We can then move down to the next level and ask, is the student experiencing homelessness? So are they lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including some of the examples we talked about on the last slide? So is the student staying with others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason? Are they living on campus, but would otherwise have no place to go? If the answer is yes, the student is considered an unaccompanied homeless youth. And in this context, youth means they are younger than 24. So the end goal of a homeless youth determination for financial aid purposes is to allow the student to be considered an independent student, which means no parent information is reported. Once a student turns 24, they are automatically considered independent by age, so there is no need to also verify their homeless status at that point. So let's say the student is unaccompanied, but they are not experiencing homelessness or they don't quite meet the definition of homeless. Then we can ask, is the student self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? So they're providing for all of their own expenses and their housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. A common example of this is when a student has been evicted or requested to leave where they are staying, and they have not been able to secure a fixed, regular, and adequate long-term plan for where to stay. So if a student is submitting the FAFSA as for the first time as a homeless youth, they will need to follow up with their financial aid office with some documentation. Documentation is laid out in the Higher Education Act of 1965 as amended, and that can come from a determination from an authorized individual. So that can come in the form of either a documented phone call, a written statement from any of these individuals, or a verifiable electronic match. Now, this list of individuals includes a school district liaison as designated under the McKinney-Vento Act, or their designee. It includes a director or designee of a director of an emergency or transitional shelter. In the past, that shelter had to be funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That is no longer the case. So any emergency or transitional shelter, street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other programs serving individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So a good rule of thumb there is, does that program or service serve individuals experiencing homelessness? The list also includes the director of a TRIO or Gear Up program or their designee. And lastly, a financial aid administrator at another institution who made a determination in the same or previous award year. And this is mostly the case for students who are transferring from one school where a financial aid administrator made a determination for them. Now they're transferring to another school. So when a student is submitting the FAFSA, they will be asked a question, Since July 1st of 2024 for the 2025-26 FAFSA, has a student experienced homelessness, essentially? Have they been unaccompanied and homeless or unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness? If they answer no, they will have some other options, some other questions that will be asked. And at the end of the personal circumstances section of the FAFSA, they will be asked, do any unusual circumstances prevent the student from contacting their parents, or would contacting their parents pose a risk to the student? And then it lists some examples that may qualify as an unusual circumstance for this purpose. Which may include leaving home due to an abusive or threatening environment, estrangement or abandonment from parents, and more, otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents. And then you may notice there is a text at the bottom of this question right before the answer options that says, if the student's circumstances resulted in not having a safe and stable place to live, they may be considered a homeless youth and should review the answer to the previous question about being unaccompanied and homeless. So because many students may not be aware that their situation does in fact meet the definitions for homeless for financial aid purposes, this prompt gives the student another opportunity to go back and review their answers to that homeless question on the FAFSA. But let's say the student is not experiencing homelessness or they don't meet the criteria for homelessness or at risk of homelessness. If they meet any of the criteria in this list for this question, they can answer yes and then would need to follow up the financial aid office for what's typically called a dependency override or unusual circumstances. So there are other options to be considered an independent student, even if they are not experiencing homelessness. But I do want to emphasize that that is a different process. So a student who's considered an unaccompanied homeless youth, or that process for being considered an unaccompanied homeless youth, as I said, the verification or the documentation includes either a determination from an authorized individual that we talked about a few slides ago, which can be a written statement from that individual or a documented phone call. And once the financial aid administrator has that determination, so from the McKinney-Vento liaison or their designee, which may include a high school counselor or other staff at the school, financial aid office should not be asking for any additional documentation or statements beyond that determination. And another difference is that a student can still have a relationship with their parents. They can still be in communication or in contact with their parents and still meet the definitions as either an unaccompanied homeless youth or an unaccompanied youth who is self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. Now, some places where the dependency override differs is that the process can vary slightly depending on the institution and that financial aid office. And so typically, a dependency override will include third-party letters and statements, often requiring a wet signature, sometimes on professional letterhead. And the dependency override looks more at the relationship with the parent. So they're looking more at the severance of that relationship. So some of the key differences is that a dependency override usually requires more documentation and looks at the relationship between students and parents, whereas the unaccompanied homeless youth process has less determination, less documentation, either a determination from one of the authorized individuals, and if that is not available, the financial aid administrator makes that determination based on either a written statement from the student or a documented interview with the student. But again, should not be requesting further documentation beyond that written statement or that documented interview. And they're looking at the housing situation rather than the relationship with the parents. Now, when you registered for this webinar, we asked you to submit some of your tough scenarios, and we received a lot of great scenarios that unfortunately we just don't have time to address all of them in this hour. So I want to give a few honorable mentions, so to speak, and hopefully address some common questions that we receive before we dive into our scenarios. So first, A student must be a citizen or an eligible non-citizen, such as a permanent resident, to qualify for federal financial aid through the FAFSA. So most international students or undocumented students are not eligible to file the FAFSA. Now, some states have an alternative state application that mirrors the FAFSA that allows undocumented students to apply for state and institutional aid, but the general policy for those states may vary depending on the individual state. Additionally, students with a homeless youth determination are considered independent, which means no parent information is required on the FAFSA. So if a student has a determination, they do not need to be requesting any documentation or even cooperation from their parents. And one other caveat I'll throw out with this too is that just because a student is considered independent or has a homeless youth determination does not necessarily mean that they would be receiving more financial aid. It just means that they can apply for financial aid without their parent information, which means a different formula is used. And so some independent students receive less financial aid, some students receive more. And once a student receives that homeless youth determination, there may be additional requirements for their financial aid. So just because they've completed that determination, there may still be more steps before they're eligible to receive financial aid. Some common examples might be verifying their identity, providing a copy of their taxes or other documents, as well as providing statements about uh, various aspects of their situation, whether it's housing, financial, or household size. And the legal definition of homelessness does include sharing the housing of others, as well as living on campus dorms. So if a student is staying with their boyfriend or girlfriend or their partner's family, if that student would not be considered unaccompanied because they are not staying with a parent or legal guardian. So emphasis on legal there with the guardian. And then we would look at the housing situation to determine homelessness. And again, for documentation, includes either a determination from an authority, which is a written statement, documented phone call, or a verifiable electronic match. Or if that is not available, the student can provide a written statement or a documented interview with the financial aid office. The financial aid office should not be asking for any further documentation beyond that determination or that written statement unless they need some more information about whether those definitions are met. And students may still qualify as an independent student even if the definitions are not met for unaccompanied and homeless or unaccompanied self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. That's typically called a dependency override or unusual circumstances. In either case, a student would need to contact the financial aid office to learn what their process is. And then last reminder before we jump into our scenarios and maybe pause for some questions. Parents on the FAFSA are limited to either a biological parent, adoptive parent, or a step parent if that person is currently married to a biological or adoptive parent. So if a student is staying with their grandma, that grandma, unless they have a legal guardianship or over the student or uh, I'm sorry, unless that grandma has adopted that student, they would not be considered a parent on the FAFSA. And a student who has a legal guardianship after the age of 13 is considered independent automatically as well. So if someone has a legal guardianship after the age of 13, they are considered independent. And then as a reminder, the definition for unaccompanied means they are not living with a parent or legal guardian. So they may be staying with a family friend or extended family member, but if that person is not a legal guardian or their parent, that student could be considered unaccompanied. So that was a lot of information. I want to take a quick pause here to see what kind of questions we have and what we need to address.
All right, Caleb. So we're getting a lot of questions in, and I just want to reiterate, you will be getting a copy of these PowerPoint slides as well as the recording in a few days. So I know people are frantically taking notes and might be missing a few things here and there. No worries. You will get a copy of the recording, and then I put in the chat the PDF of the PowerPoint. So you already will have that right away. Let's do a few questions here, Caleb. We have someone is asking, if a student is staying with someone else, can it be a boyfriend and a girlfriend? Does it really matter who the person that they're staying with is?
That is a good question. I would say it only matters who they're staying with if that person is a legal guardian or has adopted the student. But if the person they're staying with is not a parent who would be reported on the FAFSA, so if we look at our last slide here, a biological, adoptive, or step parent, or a legal guardian, that student would still be considered unaccompanied.
Fabulous. And we have another question here, just another clarification. What happens if a student is homeless but with their families? So the whole family is experiencing homelessness. Can they still fill out the FAFSA? What does that process look like?
Yes, a student who is experiencing homelessness but is still with their family, or I'll emphasize here with their parents, they would be considered a dependent student because they do not fit the criteria for unaccompanied. So in these scenarios, the student would submit the FAFSA and would include their parent information, but I would highly recommend reaching out to the financial aid office to ask for what is called a professional judgment, in which the financial aid office will collect some documents and statements to see if they can reevaluate that student's financial aid eligibility based on current circumstances rather than the tax year that's requested on the FAFSA. So for example, the 2025-26 FAFSA that starts in July and August of 2025 uses tax information from 2023. So if the student has experienced homelessness with their family, the situation has changed at any point since 2023 that would significantly impact their financial aid eligibility. Financial aid office can complete that professional judgment to recalculate that student's financial aid eligibility based on current circumstances. So the short answer is they still submit the FAFSA, they use parent information, but they'll want to contact the financial aid office to request a professional judgment to recalculate based on current circumstances.
And let's do one more question here on the topic of taxes. Does the student have to add the parent's income if the student is being claimed on their parents' taxes? The student, I think, lives in a homeless shelter while they're applying for the FAFSA. How does that all play out?
That is a great question. That's one that we receive often and is very confusing because there's similar language used between dependency on taxes and dependency on financial aid. But the short answer is it does not matter whether whether the parent claims the student as dependent on their taxes. So a student can still be considered independent. They can still be considered homeless for financial aid purposes, even if they're claimed as dependent on their parents' taxes, even if they are still on health insurance plans from their parents. We just look at the definitions provided. So is the student unaccompanied? Are they living in the physical custody of a parent or legal guardian? And then do they lack a fixed, irregular, and adequate nighttime residence? Or are they paying for all of their own expenses and are at risk of their housing ceasing to be fixed, regular, and adequate? So again, the student can still have a relationship with their parents, they can be a dependent on their parents' taxes, and they can still meet these definitions.
All right, thank you. Well, keep getting the questions coming in. We're going to pivot and do a few scenarios. So as Caleb mentioned, in the registration for this webinar, we asked people to write down your real life scenarios that you are working with that kind of trip you up, that you have some funky questions. So from the lens of a K-12 liaison, a counselor, or a service provider, this is our mindset. Imagine you're, again, a homeless liaison or a counselor or or service provider. A student comes to you in these scenarios, and we're going to put these as a poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll. Oh, thank you, Caleb, for launching it for me. But a student's living in an apartment on their own. They're paying for all of their expenses. She has very limited contact with her parents has had very limited contact for her parents for a few years now. She doesn't have an eviction notice. Her apartment has all the necessary utilities. She wants to apply for financial aid, but her parents are refusing to complete their portion of the FAFSA. So we're going to give folks a few more seconds to put in their answer, and we'll go to the next slide in just a little bit more. It's very fun to see kind of where everyone's looking, but I'm going to go ahead and, for the purposes of time, end the poll and launch it so people can see what the results are. All right. So I know we didn't get to everyone, but it was pretty, kind of a little half and half between approve unaccompanied homeless youth or not unaccompanied homeless youth suggests unusual circumstances, which is what we are saying here. So looking back at the student situation, she would not be considered an unaccompanied homeless youth. It is true, she's unaccompanied. She is on her own, not with her parents or guardian. But let's look at our housing pieces. Her housing appears to be fixed and regular. You can ask maybe a little bit more questions about the conditions of the apartment, maybe, prying in about the utilities, but we had seen on the previous example, everything seemed okay. Let's say the scenario, the student is on the lease, her name's on the lease, she has a private place to sleep and bathe. It is not substandard, so would not meet the definition of unaccompanied and homeless. Looking at the second definition, unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homeless. Again, unaccompanied, the student is self-supporting. They appear to be paying for their housing, no eviction notices, no missed rent payments. And so we can say that they aren't at risk because, again, they don't have those eviction notices. For these situations, we would suggest an unusual circumstance. So depending on the relationship with the student's parents, we'll want to ask a little bit more clarifying questions and perhaps consider a dependency override. And so on this next slide here, we have some suggestions of what the student can do and what you can do to help the student. Number one would be to contact the financial aid office to consider a dependency override. They'll ask some questions regarding the relationship with the student's parents, and they might ask from some required documentation, third-party letters, statements. And if you recall, this is the screenshot of the question that Caleb had shown before of, unusual circumstances of being not able to provide parent information. This is what we're talking about. And if a dependency override is denied, the alternative for that student would be to see if we can add parent information to the FAFSA, really try to explain that to the parent, because we recognize sometimes parents might be a little bit wary of including information on the FAFSA. So trying to do a little bit of educating of what that information is for and why that's necessary. Or the other alternative would be that the student would just be eligible for unsubsidized loans. So there's a few different options for the student being able to fill out the FAFSA and to be considered an independent student. Unfortunately, in this scenario, with the information that we have right now, it would not be the route of an unaccompanied homeless youth. But they are very tricky. It is a very gray, tricky line between unusual circumstances and unaccompanied homeless youth. Let's look at this next scenario. If we can go ahead and pop up the next poll. Thank you, Caleb. We have a student who was independent last year as an unaccompanied homeless youth at their institution. They submitted the FAFSA for the subsequent year, indicating, my situation hasn't changed. I'm still an unaccompanied homeless youth. The student hasn't provided any statements to the financial aid office about whether their situation has changed. So, you're helping the student, they're reaching back out to you. Let's say you're a service provider. Would the financial aid office approve the student's independent status for this next year?
I'll just jump in real quick to say that I accidentally launched the wrong poll. So if you already voted on this one, please vote again. That's my fault. I apologize.
All right, thank you. So we'll give it a few more seconds here about, okay. Read the scenario. I was like, what just happened? Read the scenario that's on the poll. So students homeless a few months after graduating from high school and is now on their own. They're reaching out to you as a high school counselor. Hey, I'm filling out the FAFSA. I needed an unaccompanied homeless youth determination. Can the counselor provide a determination for the student? Okay, let's go ahead and end the poll and launch the results. Amazing. So we have a few people saying, don't provide the determination, refer to the financial aid office. Correct. So this one is if the McKinney-Vento liaison or the designated their designee maintain contact with a student and say, like, yes, I've been in touch with a student. I know that the student their situation has not changed. They continue to meet the definition of an unaccompanied homeless youth. I'm really close to the student. I'm aware of their living situation. Yes, the liaison, the designee can provide a determination, but still maintaining, the student was an unaccompanied homeless youth for this period of time while they were enrolled in school. I am aware that their situation hasn't changed. So yes, that is true. But if no determination is available, if the student wasn't identified, or if no determination is available, then it'd be the financial aid administrator's responsibility to make a determination, either based on a written statement from the student or a documented interview with the student. And you are having a copy of these slides already. So as you can see in purple, we link to exactly where in the law and the statute and the Department of Education guidance, where it emphasizes and reaffirms these answers. So if you're ever in this scenario and you're like, okay, Jillian and Caleb talked about this, where do they say that this is found? We link to all of it in the purple slides, and we'll have a little section at the end on advocacy. All right, let's keep going with our next scenario here. Scenario number 3 for our K-12 and service provider group. So let's redo this poll. We have a student who is staying with her parents at a family friend's house. They qualify under McKinney-Vento as being doubled up, and the student sleeps on the living room couch. The student is applying for financial aid for the upcoming fall semester. Given this situation, would the student qualify as unaccompanied and either homeless or unaccompanied and self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? Let's look through. Let's give a few more seconds here of some Q&A, of some polling. All right. Let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results out. So for the folks who have responded, we had about 102 people said, not unaccompanied homeless youth, parent information is needed. And that is correct. If you recall, the student is with their parents. So because the student is with their parents, they are not unaccompanied. They're in the physical custody of their parents. The student would be considered a dependent student and will need to report and include parent information on the FAFSA. As Caleb kind of answered one of the questions in our Q&A before, If the household income has changed significantly since the tax year reported on the FAFSA, you can always ask the financial aid office for professional judgment to make those alterations. We also want to see if the student can reach out to the institution that they're at or hope to attend and talk to the financial aid office, a basic needs office, a student support office, just any other group at the institution to see if there's any additional resources that are available for all students experiencing homelessness, or if there's any other emergency funding that might be available. So for example, there might be a specific program supporting students experiencing homelessness that the student might be eligible for that might give them access to year-round housing or additional case management support. So it's always good just to follow up with the financial aid office if a student is experiencing homelessness with their families, just because there might be additional institutional support that's there. All right. Scenario number 4. This one's a tricky one. A student has bounced back and forth between staying with his parents and being kicked out of the house. When the student's kicked out, he can stay with a friend for a few weeks until it's safe to return home. He was recently allowed to come back home with his parents, but he fears he may be kicked out again soon. Would this student qualify as unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? And we get this question all the time. Every time we are presenting in person, this question comes up. All right, let's end the poll here, share the results. So most people said not unaccompanied, suggests unusual circumstances. We had some people say approve unaccompanied homeless youth, and then we had some people said, more information's needed. And this one's really, really tricky. More information is needed, but it also really depends on the timing of all of this, and if the student is able to get a determination during those time periods. So looking at the FAFSA, we're looking very specifically if the student met the definitions of unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness at any time since July 1st, and for the purposes of the 26-27 FAFSA, July 1st, 2025. So if the student met the definition on or after July 1st of 2025, and say they were able to receive a determination from their McKinney-Vento liaison. Their McKinney-Vento liaison provided them with a determination, said, yep, based on the situations of where you're at right now, I can provide you a determination for your living situation for the FAFSA. In that situation, the financial aid administrator must accept the determination. However, with the back and forth of what's been going on with the student, say the student doesn't have a determination at all from a liaison, from a service provider, from anyone. The financial aid administrator is required to make a determination, but must look at the student's current living circumstances. So again, because there's that back and forth, wherever that student is at that moment in time when they're meeting with the financial aid office, that is how the financial aid office will make a determination based on current circumstances. So if that current circumstances with the student is living with their parents, they would not meet the definition of an unaccompanied homeless youth with a financial aid administrator. So we know that was a really confusing and complex situation. So definitely more information is needed. We got to look at the timing and whether there are determinations based on that point in time. Do we have another slide on this one, Caleb? Or, okay. Did I miss anything on that section? I know that one's a little complicated. Just anything you wanted to add in there, Caleb, feel free to jump in.
I think the only thing that I would add here is just more talking to the financial aid administrators directly, is that rule of thumb is if you receive a determination from one of the authorities, You're required to accept it, even if their situation has changed. However, you may want to use due diligence to determine what may best benefit the student, either dependent or independent, as far as their SAI or their financial aid eligibility goes. So, the rule of thumb is use the determination if you have it, but if you're able to determine which route, either dependent or independent, would most benefit the student, then you would go with that option. And then you may recall one of the changes from the FAFSA Simplification Act is that students who are independent through a homeless youth determination are now to be presumed independent in subsequent years unless there's conflicting information or the student has notified the financial aid office that their situation has changed. In this scenario, if you have information that the student is living back with their parents, you would not presume them independent in that next year unless situation changes again. Yeah.
So let's pause for just a question or two before we jump into more scenarios. And again, we wanted to make this interactive because we know there's a lot of scenarios and it's not always black and white. We have someone asking the question, Caleb, can students appeal financial aid decisions?
That is a very interesting question. An unaccompanied homeless youth determination is not considered a professional judgment under the same rules as a dependency override. And so a dependency override cannot be appealed. My interpretation of the way the law is written is that because the unaccompanied homeless youth is not under the same professional judgment requirements, that it can be appealed, or that a student could apply or appeal for a homeless youth determination more than once in the school year because their situation can change partway through the year, oftentimes without warning. So my interpretation is that yes, it can be appealed.
And then we just had a question pop up, which I know we get these questions a lot. What if a student isn't kicked out of their home? They're choosing to leave their home on their own. Are they an unaccompanied homeless youth?
Yes, so one of the part of the Higher Education Act that impacts unaccompanied homeless youth lays out that if the financial aid administrator is making the determination, that determination should be made without regard to the reason the student is experiencing homelessness. So it doesn't matter whether the student was forced out of the house, whether they chose to leave, whether they're living in a place that they want to be, the reasons or the events leading up to the student experiencing homelessness should not be taken into account when determining whether those definitions are met. So we're focusing on if the definitions are met and not why those definitions are met. But that is a great question.
Okay, so I know you have some scenarios that we want to run through. So let's jump right back in.
All right, so looking at scenario one for financial aid administrators, I'll get this launched out here. A student provided a statement to the financial aid office since they are not able to provide a determination. And so in that statement, they said that they live in campus housing during the semester, but during breaks, they stay with their girlfriend's family because they do not feel safe staying with their parents. So as a financial aid administrator, would you approve their unaccompanied homeless youth? Would you suggest that they appeal for an unusual circumstance or dependency override? Do we require parent information or do we need more information? All right, I'll give it about 5 more seconds here. All right, looks like most of us agreed that we would approve this student. So we do know that they meet the unaccompanied portion, so they're not living in the physical custody of their parents or legal guardians. So the girlfriend and the girlfriend's family would not be considered a legal guardian in this case. And then the homeless criteria does include youth living in the school dormitory if they would otherwise be homeless. And so this is included in the FSA handbook in Chapter 5 of the Application Verification Guide. And as we just talked about, we don't need to know the reason why it is unsafe to return home. So we don't need to know the details of the relationship with the parents and why the student is choosing not to be staying with their parents. All right, so we're going on to scenario 2. So student was independent last year as an unaccompanied homeless youth. At your institution, they submitted the FAFSA for the subsequent year, indicating they are an unaccompanied homeless youth. The student has not provided any statements to the financial aid office about whether their situation has changed. So can this financial aid office approve the student's independent status for this subsequent year? And this was the one that I accidentally launched earlier, so I apologize if you wish you could change your vote. But the two options here are either to approve their independence without an additional statement or documentation, or we need that student to provide a statement in order to declare or to approve their independence. I will go ahead and okay, it looks like it may not have allowed you to vote a second time, so I apologize for that. So as we know, students are required to be presumed independent in subsequent years as long as the financial aid office has not received conflicting information about the student's independence or the student has not informed the institution that their circumstances have changed. So as far as the financial aid office knows, the situation has not changed with the student. They indicated on their FAFSA again, they are a homeless youth. So the financial aid office can go ahead and approve that student's independent status. Now, you do have the right to ask if the situation has changed, but this process cannot delay the awarding or the disbursement of their financial aid, even if the student does not reply to those messages or does not provide a satisfactory answer. All right, so scenario 3, an eligible non-citizen is filling out the FAFSA. Her parents were recently deported to another country. She and her sister live with her friend's family in the US while they figure things out. She shares a room with two other people and does not currently have a long-term plan for where to stay. I'll give about 5 more seconds here. Yeah, it looks like an overwhelming majority agreed to approve the unaccompanied homeless youth. So we do know the student is unaccompanied. They are not living in the physical custody of her parents or legal guardians. And the family friends that she's staying with are not considered parents or legal guardians for these purposes. And it does not matter, even if the student has contact or communication with their parents, they are still unaccompanied because they are not living in the physical custody of those parents. And then the homeless definitions do appear to be met. They're sharing the housing of others temporarily because they have nowhere else to go. And then the Federal Student Aid Handbook also includes language about youth who are migrants who qualify as experiencing homelessness due to other circumstances described above. All right, so two more scenarios from the perspective of a financial aid administrator. So based on a statement from the student, he is experiencing homelessness on his own because he decided to leave home after a fight with his parents. Upon digging further, the financial aid administrator discovered the fight was over whether he should be helping with chores around the house. So we know the definitions are met, but the reason that those definitions are met is because the student disagreed that he should be helping out with chores. It looks like I'm having an issue launching this poll. I'm not sure what that issue is, but we will just go ahead and move forward in the interest of time. So we know the definitions are met for unaccompanied and homeless, which means we can approve their unaccompanied homeless youth status. And again, we need to focus on if the definitions are met and not the why. So you may learn that the reason that the student left home is one that you may disagree with, but that should not be taken into account. And then one other thing too that I will advise you to keep in the back of your mind is that students experiencing homelessness may not feel comfortable expressing or communicating the full details or explaining the complicated situation that they are in. So the details may not, add up to the full story or make sense to you as a financial aid administrator, but we just need to know whether they are meeting the definitions for unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness. And Jillian, if you're able to launch this last poll.
Yeah, I am not sure what's happening here. I'm having the same issue too. So I think
Okay.
we'll just keep going through.
All right. We apologize for technical difficulties, but fortunately, this is our last scenario for the day. A student lives in off-campus housing, sharing an apartment with friends. He provides for all of his own expenses, including rent and tuition. But when the semester starts, he will have to drop his hours at work to focus on his classes. He hasn't missed any rent payments or received any eviction notices, but he is concerned about making rent once he is full-time. He's afraid of losing his housing. So does this student qualify as either unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? Most likely that student would not qualify. So we can determine that they are unaccompanied. They're not living in the physical custody of their parents. It doesn't appear that the homeless criteria are met, so their housing appears to be fixed and regular. We could ask some more questions about the conditions of their apartment, like utilities or a private place to sleep or bathe. Um, but it sounds like the student may not be currently meeting the definitions for homeless. So then we can look at the at-risk and self-supporting. They do appear to be self-supporting. They're providing for all of their own expenses. But as of right now, it does not appear that they are at risk of homelessness. There are no clear signs that their housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate at this time. So if the student in, say, a couple weeks receives an eviction notice or is being asked to leave that apartment, then we can say that that student is at risk of homelessness as long as they've not been able to secure a long-term, fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. All right, so we have a couple minutes left. We want to go over some advocacy and resources and close us out here. But financial aid administrators have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of responsibilities beyond just determining whether students are independent through homeless youth determinations. So some may not be aware of some of the changes for unaccompanied homeless youth processes from the FAFSA Simplification Act. So if you are working with a student who is experiencing homelessness and is having trouble communicating with financial aid office, we highly recommend including links and quotes from a lot of the resources that we have been referencing throughout this presentation, namely the Higher Education Act of 1965, as amended, the July 2024 electronic announcement from the Federal Student Aid Office, and then the Federal Student Aid Handbook, specifically in Chapter 5 of the Application Verification Guide. And so these slides will be available to you all. This will also be posted on our website along with this recording. So you have access to the slides and all of the links that are embedded within. But the next few slides I'm going to breeze through fairly quickly here just for the interest of time. But if you're working with a student and the financial aid office is requesting new documentation or recertification for subsequent years, we have some quotes here from the Higher Education Act that require that the student must be presumed independent in subsequent years unless there is conflicting information, as well as the July 2024 electronic announcement from the FSA office. Students should be presumed independent. If financial aid office is not accepting a determination letter or determination from one of the authorized individuals, we again have some quotes here from Higher Education Act and the July 2024 announcement. And then lastly, if the financial aid office is wanting to know more about why the student is experiencing homelessness in order to make their determination, we have this quote from Higher Education Act that the determination must be made without regard to the reasons the student is unaccompanied youth or unaccompanied at risk and self-supporting. And this is also, again, supported in the electronic announcement. And so here are some resources for you to please take advantage of on our website and the resources that we just talked about on the last few slides. We also have a few upcoming webinars. On September 30th, we have a webinar on expanding college access within the Common App. So really diving into the nitty-gritty of the Common App and how that can open up access to college for youth experiencing homelessness. And then in November 13th, we will have a FAFSA webinar that will go over the 26-27 FAFSA, any changes to financial aid and updates on the FAFSA form and the progress. As of now, the beta testing is going very well. The second phase of beta testing was opened about a week early, and we're hearing good things so far. So stay tuned and tune into our webinars in September and November.
Caleb, I'm going to jump in before maybe we answer a question or two, but we've had amazing questions come in. We are going to compile these questions into a Google Doc. We'll answer them, and then we'll send it back out to all the attendees here. It'll take us a few days to work on the questions with the holiday coming up. So it might take a little bit of time, but we definitely will get a copy of the PowerPoint and recording sent to you in these next few days. I had one question here that, again, we get this question all the time. Caleb, can you provide some clarity? So can like a student just move out of their home willingly, complete the FAFSA and say, yep, I'm an unaccompanied homeless youth? Is it really just that easy?
So the answer, as always in financial aid, is it depends. Again, we don't need to know the reason why. We don't need to know why the student chose to leave their home. But if they've left the home for whatever reason and they're unaccompanied, then we can look at, does their situation meet the definitions for homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, then the student is considered an unaccompanied homeless youth on the FAFSA.
Yep. And we have a sample form, which I had put into the chat, which kind of outlines what sort of questions you can ask to answer some of those questions. So asking about the student's living situation, kind of get an idea of the timeline, just so you can paint a picture and have that full understanding. But the questions we do not want to be asking are like, well, why did you leave home? And trying to get into those nitty-gritty details. I have another question here that I wanted to ask. Let me find it. Oftentimes students or financial aid administrators or liaisons might receive statements from the students saying, yeah, I don't live with my mom anymore, but they don't say anything about their other parents' whereabouts. Can the liaison, the financial aid administrator, can they ask additional questions about where that other parent is?
That is a fairly common question that financial aid administrators will ask. The FAFSA has a fairly stereotypical assumption of there are two biological parents. And so you may have students who have just had a single parent growing up, and so they may only tell the financial aid office about their relationship with that single parent. But the financial aid office would need to verify the second parent. And so if that parent has never been in the picture, usually just a statement will suffice for that.
All right. Well, it looks like we are at that time. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Caleb, for walking us through these scenarios and giving us those overviews. We'll be providing a copy of these questions and answers in a Google Doc in the next week or so. It's a busy September. Back to school is here. Ways for you all to connect with us here at Schoolhouse Connection. And our emails were on the previous slide. But thank you all so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.